Tonight, as you settle into rest, allow your mind to travel far from the present moment. Drift away from the familiar world of glowing screens and modern noise, and picture instead a horizon softened by endless sand. A faint desert wind brushes the dunes, whispering stories that are older than written memory itself. These are the stories of ancient Egypt, the land where the Nile flowed like a silver thread through golden landscapes, and where gods and humans shared the same timeless stage. This evening, you are invited to listen to one story in particular, the full tale of Anubis. He is perhaps one of the most recognizable of Egypt's gods, a figure with the sleek black head of a jackal and the body of a man. His presence has lingered in the imagination of cultures for thousands of years. Yet behind his striking image lies a tapestry of myth, of ritual, and of human longing for comfort in the face of life's greatest mystery, death. The voice you hear will move gently, steadily, never rushing. The story is not a tale of action and thunder, but of silence, devotion, and care. It is a narrative that accompanied the people of the Nile for generations, spoken in quiet temples, painted on stone walls, and whispered during the most intimate of moments, when the living stood beside their dead, hoping for safe passage into eternity. To hear the story of Anubis is to step softly into that ancient stillness. As you rest, you may find your mind picturing the desert at night. The air is cool after the long, bright heat of the day. The stars above stretch in unbroken brilliance, far brighter than the city skies we know today. In that hush, the world seems eternal. Time does not move quickly here. It flows slowly, like the Nile itself in the flood season, carrying silt and memory alike toward the sea. This is the rhythm in which Egyptian stories were told, unhurried, steady, respectful of the weight they carried. Anubis was not a god of noise or spectacle. He was not the bringer of storms or the lord of the blazing sun. Instead, he was the one who stood watch in the shadows, guiding and protecting, performing the sacred work that few spoke of aloud but everyone relied upon. In his care, the Egyptians saw more than the end of life. They saw the promise of transition, the reassurance that death was not chaos but order, not disappearance but passage. Tonight, in these hours of rest, we will unfold his story in its entirety. This is not a single tale, but a collection woven together, part history, part myth, part reflection. Different traditions spoke of Anubis in different ways. Some said he was born of Ra, the sun god. Others believed he was the child of Osiris and Nephthys, conceived in secret. Some stories made him the devoted guardian of Osiris himself. Across these versions, the essence remains the same. He is the eternal embalmer, the weigher of hearts, the guide who walks beside souls as they make their way into the afterlife. As we move through the chapters of his story, the pace will remain unhurried. We will not only recount myths, but also pause to imagine the world that gave rise to them. What did the ancient Egyptians see in the jackal, a creature that prowled the edges of their cemeteries? What comfort did they find in picturing a god who would not abandon them at the threshold of eternity? In exploring these questions, we enter not just mythology, but also the intimate fears and hopes of human beings who lived thousands of years ago. Perhaps, as you listen, you may feel a subtle shift, the way the mind changes when it contemplates something vast and timeless. The Egyptians believed the afterlife was not a dream but a structured reality, complete with paths, gates, judges, and guardians. Anubis was at the center of this imagined landscape. He was not a terrifying figure but a necessary one, ensuring that justice was done, that truth was measured, and that souls found their rightful place. This introduction is not intended to overwhelm with detail. It is here to prepare the ground, much like the Nile's floods prepared the earth for planting. Just as the farmers of Egypt waited patiently for the river to leave its rich black soil behind, so too do we wait, calmly, for the story to unfold. Each section to come will be like a furrow in that fertile earth, carrying its own images and rhythms, but always connected to the whole. As you listen, let the edges of the day soften. If you find sleep approaching, that is welcome. These stories were never meant to demand wakefulness. They were meant to comfort, to surround the listener with a sense of continuity, with the knowledge that death and life, beginning and ending, were parts of the same eternal pattern. Anubis embodies that pattern, He is the bridge, the watchman, the companion in silence. So, with the desert wind at our backs and the slow current of the Nile beneath us, we begin. This is the entire story of Anubis, his origins, his duties, his symbols, his temples, his myths, and his enduring legacy. It is a journey across time, across belief, across the thin line between the world of the living and the world of the dead. It is a story that does not end, but simply changes shape, much like the stars that wheel across the Egyptian sky. Rest here, and let the sands of time cover the noise of the present. The story awaits. To understand the story of Anubis, we must first imagine the stage upon which his presence was felt most deeply, the Egyptian desert. This desert is not merely an empty space. It is a living environment, shaped by wind and silence, stretching beyond the eye's reach. By day, the sand shimmers with a brilliance that can overwhelm the senses, the horizon quivering in the heat. But it is at night, when the sun has withdrawn and the world is bathed in silver starlight, that the desert becomes something far more timeless and profound. Imagine lying back on the cool ground, the sand beneath you still warm from the day, the air finally soft after the long hours of blazing heat. Above, the night sky stretches in every direction, unbroken, filled with constellations. For the ancient Egyptians, this canopy of stars was not only beautiful but sacred. They saw in it the realms of the gods, the promise of eternity, and the map of the afterlife. Under this sky, the people whispered stories of deities who walked among them, unseen but ever present. Anubis, dark and watchful, belonged to this nocturnal world. The desert was both a friend and a danger. It provided protection to Egypt, guarding its fertile Nile valley from invasion. Yet it also reminded the people of death, arid, inhospitable, and unforgiving. To step into the desert for too long was to risk disappearance. Jackals prowled these barren places, creatures adapted to scavenging what little life they could find. Their cries in the distance were eerie, sharp reminders of the thin line between survival and loss. It was not coincidence that Anubis, god of the dead, carried the face of such an animal. In the desert's silence, jackals seemed to watch over the boundaries between life and death. To drift across this landscape in the mind is to sense both awe and calm. The dunes are never still. They shift slowly, reshaped by the wind into patterns that resemble waves upon a golden ocean. Walking among them at twilight, the world appears endless. The Egyptians felt this vastness as the realm of eternity. Just as the desert stretched without end, so too did the afterlife. And in that endlessness, a guide was needed. Someone who could lead the soul safely through the unknown. Anubis was that guide. But before we reach his figure, let us linger a little longer in the desert itself. For it is not empty. It carries the memory of all who passed through it. Traders leading caravans of goods left faint tracks in the sand, erased within hours by the wind. Soldiers on campaigns marched across it, their footsteps forgotten except by the gods. The desert swallows and preserves at once. In its dry silence, bodies buried thousands of years ago can emerge as if untouched by time. To the Egyptians, this preservation was a miracle, a sign that life could endure even in death. It is no wonder that mummification, the sacred art that Anubis guarded, found its inspiration in the desert's power to preserve. At night, the desert hums with subtle life. The call of insects, the rustle of lizards, the soft tread of jackals and foxes. All these movements were heard by ancient ears. To us, they might be faint background sounds, but to a people who lived with nature rather than apart from it, each was a voice in the dark. They gave shape to myth. A cry in the distance could be the call of a god. A shadow passing across the moonlit dunes could be more than an animal. It could be Anubis himself, watching. The Nile and the desert existed as opposites, side by side. The Nile gave life, water, crops, fish, fertile soil. The desert gave silence, mystery, and death. Yet both were necessary. Together, they shaped the Egyptian view of the universe. To sleep in this world, knowing both the abundance of the river and the emptiness of the sands, was to live with balance. And at the meeting point of life and death stood Anubis, the one who moved easily between these realms. As you picture this landscape, allow it to become calm in your mind. The desert at night is not hostile, It is quiet, eternal, a place where the noise of the world disappears. This is the environment in which the myths of Anubis were first spoken. Imagine a priest, thousands of years ago, telling the story by the glow of a lamp. Around him, the desert night presses in, vast and unchanging. His listeners, perhaps mourners, perhaps initiates, would have felt comfort in knowing that the same silence surrounding them was the silence that Anubis himself walked through. In this way, the desert itself becomes part of the myth. It is not merely a backdrop, but a reminder of the eternal. Every star above, every shifting dune, every distant cry carried on the wind, it all echoed the message of continuity, of passage, of endurance. Anubis was born from this message. He was the presence in the silence, the guardian of the unseen path. So, as we step gently out of this desert scene, we carry its stillness with us. It is the stillness that cradles the myths, the stillness that allows the imagination to wander freely, the stillness that invites sleep. From here, we will move into the question, who, truly, was Anubis? But before that answer comes, remember this. His story cannot be separated from the desert's hush, for it is in that hush that his figure first takes shape. To know Anubis, we must begin with an image that is both strange and unforgettable. The body of a man, upright and strong, crowned with the sleek black head of a jackal. His ears are tall and alert, his eyes narrow and watchful. The sheen of his dark fur is not threatening but dignified, suggesting a power that is quiet rather than boastful. In Egyptian art, he often stands in profile, one hand holding a staff, the other hanging with perfect calm. Sometimes he kneels, leaning protectively over a body laid out for embalming. Other times he presides at the scales of judgment, patient, impartial, guiding a soul toward its eternal fate. For thousands of years, this figure appeared on tomb walls, in painted papyrus scrolls, in carved statues left as offerings. Even today, when we think of Egyptian gods, Anubis stands out among the most recognizable. Yet behind this striking form lies a story that is deeper and more fluid than a single image can contain. Who truly was Anubis? In the most general sense, Anubis was the god of the dead, the protector of graves, and the guardian of souls as they made their journey into the afterlife. He was the overseer of embalming, the divine embalmer who performed the first mummification upon the body of Osiris. He was the guide of souls, leading them through the uncertain terrain beyond death. He was the weigher of hearts, ensuring that justice and truth determined each person's fate. But to leave the description here would be to oversimplify. The ancient Egyptians did not think of their gods in single, rigid roles. A deity could change across time, absorbing new qualities, taking on new responsibilities, even shifting parentage according to myth and region. Anubis was no exception. In the earliest dynasties of Egypt, he was considered one of the most important gods of death, perhaps even more central than Osiris. Over time, as Osiris grew in prominence as lord of the underworld, Anubis shifted into the role of guardian and attendant, the loyal protector rather than the supreme ruler. His identity adapted to the evolving beliefs of the people, yet his essential presence, as guardian, protector, embalmer, remained unbroken. The jackal head is not an arbitrary choice. To the Egyptians, animals carried symbolic meanings, their behaviors woven into myth. Jackals were scavengers, seen at the edges of cemeteries, digging into shallow graves. They were feared, yes, but they were also respected, for they lived on the boundary between life and decay. To embody a god in the form of a jackal was to take that liminal quality and transform it from threat into protection. If jackals haunted the desert tombs, then who better than a jackal-headed god to guard them? To turn destruction into preservation? Anubis was that transformation. His skin, often painted black in art, adds another layer of meaning. Black was not simply the color of night or decay. It was the color of the fertile silt left by the Nile after its flood, the rich soil that made life possible in Egypt. To see Anubis painted in black was not to see death alone. It was to see rebirth, fertility, and continuation. Thus, his very image carried a promise. Death was not an end, but part of a cycle. Anubis also carried titles that reveal the breadth of his character. He was called He Who Is in the Place of Embalming, a direct link to the sacred rituals of preparing the body for the afterlife. He was known as the Lord of the Sacred Land, the land being the necropolis, the city of the dead, where tombs stretched like streets through the desert. He was also invoked as the guardian of the scales, reminding worshippers that his hand rested upon the balance in the weighing of the heart. Each title shaped his presence differently, yet together they revealed a god who oversaw every stage of death's journey, from the grave to the embalming table to the halls of judgment. But Anubis was not distant. In Egyptian belief, he was close to the people. Every burial, every prayer said at a tomb, every amulet placed upon a body could invoke his protection. Unlike some gods who seemed remote in their cosmic power, Anubis was present in the most intimate and human of rituals, the farewell to a loved one, the preparation of the dead for eternity. In that sense, he was a god of comfort, not of fear. Over time, myths about his parentage emerged. Some traditions named him as the son of Ra, the sun god, making him a child of cosmic order. Others told of his birth to Nephthys, the shadowy sister of Isis, conceived in secrecy with Osiris. In this version, Anubis's very existence was a hidden truth, a child born in silence, yet destined for one of the most essential divine roles. The variety of these accounts does not diminish his significance. It shows how central he was, how different communities wove him into their understanding of creation and death. So who was Anubis? He was the liminal figure at every threshold. He was guardian of the tomb and protector of the soul. He was the silent presence in the embalming chamber, the steady hand on the scale of truth, the watchful eye at the edge of the desert. His jackal form reminded Egyptians of the thin line between life and decay, yet also of the possibility of turning fear into safety. His black skin echoed the fertile Nile, carrying the message that from death comes renewal. When we ask who Anubis was, we are not asking about a single god in a single time. We are asking about centuries of belief, shaped and reshaped by human hands and human hopes. We are asking about the presence that Egyptians felt when they faced the silence of death and the uncertainty of what lay beyond. And we are asking about the comfort they found in knowing that, whatever the journey, they would not take it alone. Anubis would be there, guiding, protecting, ensuring that order and truth remained. As you let this image settle into your mind, remember that Anubis was not a figure of terror. He was a figure of balance, of care, of reassurance. To fall asleep hearing his story is not to dwell on darkness, but to feel the steady watch of a guardian who has accompanied human souls for millennia. He is a reminder that even in the vast unknown, there is guidance. Even in silence, there is presence. And so we continue, moving deeper into his origins, to see how the myths first told of his place among the gods. When we ask where Anubis came from, we step into a part of Egyptian mythology that is not fixed but fluid. Unlike some gods whose stories were carefully preserved in single versions, Anubis's beginnings were told in different ways across centuries. These shifting origins reflect how deeply he was woven into the culture, so essential that many traditions sought to claim him as their own. To listen to these variations is to understand that myth, like the desert sands, is always moving, reshaping itself while retaining its essence. One of the earliest traditions places Anubis as the son of Ra, the great sun god. In this telling, he emerges directly from the source of light and order itself. To be born of Ra was to be tied to creation, to the eternal cycle of day and night, life and death. This version situates Anubis as a divine presence from the very beginning, one of the children of the sun who carried part of its eternal authority. If he was of Ra, then he was part of the oldest order, as ancient as light upon the Nile. Yet another tradition tells a different, more intimate story. Here, Anubis is the child of Nephthys, the goddess of shadow and boundaries. Nephthys, unlike her sister Isis, was not often the center of myth. She was associated with the edges, the places in between, just as the desert lay at the edge of the Nile's fertile soil. According to this tale, Nephthys was married to Set, the god of chaos and storms. But she lay with Osiris, lord of fertility and life, in secret. From that hidden union came a child, Anubis. In this version, his origins carry both secrecy and sorrow. He was not acknowledged by Nephthys, who feared Set's wrath, and so he was taken in by Isis, raised in compassion by the goddess who became his mother in all but name. This story has a quiet symbolism of its own. Born of shadow, secrecy, and hidden love, Anubis became the guardian of those hidden moments at the end of life. He was the child who was set aside, yet he grew to become the one who never abandoned the souls entrusted to him. If Ra's son was born in brilliance, Nephthys' son was born in silence. Both origins carry meaning, and both were told to explain how such a figure could emerge with qualities of both light and shadow. Other accounts, less widespread, sometimes named him as the child of Set himself. In these versions, the details vary, but the idea remains the same. Anubis is tied to the most powerful figures of the divine family, his parentage always connecting him to the heart of the myths. Whether of Ra, or Osiris, or Nephthys, or even Set, his role as guardian remained unchanged. His beginnings could be told in many ways because his essence transcended the details. These variations reflect something important about Egyptian belief. The gods were not fixed characters with rigid biographies. They were living presences, their identities reshaped by worship, by political changes, by the blending of traditions. Just as the Nile's flood was different each year, but always vital, so too were the stories of the gods fluid yet constant. For Anubis, the central truth was always the same. He was the protector of the dead, the one who stood beside Osiris, the one who ensured that the cycle of life and death remained unbroken. The myth of his adoption by Isis is especially tender. In it, we see the goddess of magic and motherhood taking in a child who was not her own, raising him as her son. To the Egyptians, Isis represented care, loyalty, and devotion, qualities that Anubis also embodied in his role as embalmer and guardian. It was as though the compassion of Isis flowed into him, shaping him into the god who would care for every soul with the same devotion. In this way, even his origin story was a reflection of the very duties he came to perform. To think of Anubis as the child of Ra emphasizes his authority. To think of him as the child of Nephthys and Osiris emphasizes his empathy and closeness to human sorrow. Neither story is wrong. Both reveal facets of a god who is too vast to be contained by one account alone. This fluidity also shows why he endured for so long. Across centuries, Egyptians could adapt his story to their own needs, yet his role, silent, steady, protective, never wavered. The origins of Anubis also remind us of the way Egyptians thought about family and inheritance among the gods. Divine parentage was less about physical birth and more about symbolic connection. To call him the son of Ra was to say that his power derived from the order of the cosmos. To call him the son of Osiris was to say that his role was bound to death and resurrection. To call him the son of Nephthys was to highlight his place at the boundary between worlds. Each version taught something about how people imagined death, how they found comfort in thinking about what came after. When you close your eyes and picture Anubis in these different roles, you may notice that the variations do not compete but harmonize. He can be both child of the sun and child of the shadows. He can be both cosmic and intimate. He can be both powerful and tender. The Egyptians embraced this paradox because death itself carried paradox. It was feared, yet it was also the path to eternity. It was darkness, yet it was also renewal. Anubis, born from many stories, embodied all these truths. And so, the origins of Anubis are not a single fixed moment. They are like the shifting sands of the desert, forming new shapes in every wind, but always retaining their essence as sand. Whether born of Ra, or of Nephthys and Osiris, whether raised by Isis or claimed by Set, he emerges always as the same eternal figure, the jackal-headed god who watches over the dead with unwavering care. As we leave behind these questions of birth and parentage, we carry forward their meaning. Anubis' story is not about where he began, but about what he became. To understand that, we must turn to the world of the living, to the way Egyptians thought of death itself, and why they placed such trust in the presence of this silent guardian. To understand Anubis, we must understand the place of death in the world of ancient Egypt. Unlike in many cultures, where death was often seen only as a final ending, the Egyptians embraced it as an essential stage of life's journey. To them, death was not a wall but a doorway, not a silence but a passage into a world beyond. And at the heart of this passage stood the gods who protected and guided the soul, none more intimately than Anubis. The Nile Valley was a place of cycles. Every year, the river swelled with floods, covering the land in water and leaving behind rich black soil. Out of this soil came grain, fruits, and life itself. The Egyptians lived by watching these cycles repeat: flood and drought, planting and harvest, life and death. It is no surprise that they saw human life in the same rhythm. Death was not the breaking of the cycle, but part of it. Like the river's retreat, it was followed by renewal. For them, the afterlife was not abstract. It was a real place, structured and orderly, reflecting their own world but free of suffering. They called it the field of reeds, a realm where the soul would live in peace, farming fertile land, reuniting with family, basking in the company of the gods. To reach it, however, was no simple matter. The dead had to pass through trials, to be judged for their deeds, to prove themselves worthy of eternity. This belief gave rise to elaborate rituals of burial and preservation, rituals that became the center of Egyptian religion. It is in this context that Anubis's role becomes so vital. The Egyptians knew that bodies decayed. They saw it in the desert, where the heat and dryness could preserve or destroy. To them, the body was not something to discard, but something essential to the soul's identity. Without a body, the soul could not survive in the afterlife. Thus, to care for the body was to care for the spirit. Embalming and mummification became sacred acts, not only preserving flesh but preserving the chance of eternity. And who stood at the heart of this sacred duty? Anubis, the god of embalming, the one who first preserved Osiris. The funerary process was not simply technical, it was spiritual. The rituals included prayers, spells, and offerings, all meant to protect the deceased from harm and guide them safely into the next world. Priests performed these duties in the image of Anubis, sometimes even wearing masks of the jackal-headed god as they worked. In this way, the presence of Anubis was invoked directly, his divine hands imagined as guiding the human ones. For the Egyptians, death was also deeply social. A proper burial was not only a matter of personal fate, it was an act of love and duty from the living toward the dead. Families prepared tombs with care, filling them with food, clothes, tools, and charms, all to ensure comfort in the next life. Without burial, a soul risked becoming restless, wandering, unable to reach peace. This fear gave Anubis another role. He was the protector of graves, the one who kept tombs safe from robbers, animals, and spirits that might disturb them. His jackal head was a promise that scavengers would be turned away, that rest would be undisturbed. The importance of death shaped Egyptian society on every level. Pharaohs built monumental tombs, pyramids, and temples designed to last forever, staffed with priests who carried out rituals long after the ruler's passing. Nobles and commoners alike prepared their own burial goods, sometimes saving for years to afford a coffin or shroud. Death was not an interruption of life, but part of life's planning, a stage everyone prepared for with as much care as planting fields or building homes. Yet, in this preparation, there was comfort. To know that rituals existed, that gods like Anubis stood guard, meant that death was not terrifying chaos but a transition guided by order. Just as the sun set each evening only to rise again, so too would a person die only to rise into eternity. The presence of Anubis reassured the Egyptians that they would not walk that path alone. In myths, Anubis is often described as calm and impartial. He does not punish or reward directly. He ensures that justice itself decides. In the weighing of the heart, he places the organ upon the scale and balances it against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth. His role is not to bend the judgment, but to guarantee its fairness. This image reflects the Egyptian understanding of death. It was not to be feared as random or cruel, but respected as just. Every person, rich or poor, stood before the same scale. Every heart was measured by the same truth. The Egyptians also believed that the living could help the dead by speaking their names, by bringing offerings to their tombs, by keeping their memory alive. In this, Anubis served not only the deceased, but also the living, for his protection extended to those acts of remembrance. To honor the dead was to honor Anubis, and in turn, to ensure one's own protection when the time came. As you picture this world, you may notice that death feels less like an ending and more like a continuation. The rituals, the prayers, the tombs filled with gifts, all speak to a culture that saw death as part of life's great journey. And at every turn of that journey, Anubis was present, at the tomb to protect, at the embalming table to preserve, at the scales to judge, and at the threshold of the afterlife to guide. This way of thinking transformed the Egyptians' relationship to mortality. They lived with death not as a shadow looming in fear, but as a certainty that could be met with preparation and faith. Their comfort came not from denying death, but from embracing it as part of the cosmic cycle. In that embrace, Anubis was both guardian and companion, the ever-watchful guide whose black form reminded them that life and death were inseparable, that endings were also beginnings. As we leave this reflection, we carry with us a clearer sense of why Anubis mattered so deeply. He was not just a figure of myth, but a necessity for a people whose entire vision of life was tied to eternity. To understand Anubis is to understand the Egyptian conviction that death was not defeat but transformation. And it is to see why they placed such trust in the silent, patient jackal god who stood watch over every soul. In the myths of ancient Egypt, one story above all others explains why Anubis became the guardian of the dead, the silent overseer of embalming and mummification. It is the story of Osiris, the just king, and Set, his jealous brother. It is the story of betrayal, of death, and of a god who, through reverence and care, preserved life beyond death. From this tale came Anubis's eternal role, the first embalmer. Osiris, so the stories tell, was the ruler of Egypt in the earliest days. He brought order to the land, teaching people farming, law, and ritual. His wife and sister, Isis, was by his side, embodying wisdom and devotion. Together they ruled a world where harmony reigned. But Set, Osiris's brother, grew envious and resentful. He was the god of chaos, of storms, of violence. Where Osiris created, Set sought to destroy. In one of the most famous Egyptian myths, Set devised a plan to murder his brother. He tricked Osiris into lying inside a beautifully crafted chest, promising it as a gift to whoever fit it perfectly. Once Osiris lay down, Set slammed the lid shut, sealed it with molten lead, and threw it into the Nile. The river carried the chest away, and Osiris was lost. When Isis discovered what had been done, grief filled her. She searched tirelessly, guided by devotion, until at last she found the chest and retrieved Osiris's body. But Set was not finished. He struck again, tearing Osiris's body into pieces and scattering them across Egypt. It seemed that death, chaos, and destruction would triumph. And yet, this was not the end. Isis gathered the pieces of Osiris, with the help of Nephthys, her sister, and Anubis, the jackal-headed god. It is here that Anubis steps into the myth fully. He was not merely an observer. He was the one who knew how to treat the body, how to preserve it against decay, how to prepare it for eternity. With tender hands, he reassembled Osiris, joining the pieces of the broken king. He washed and purified the body. He wrapped it carefully in linen, layer upon layer, each fold sealed with prayers and magic. This was the first mummification, and Anubis was its master. In that sacred act, he showed humanity how to care for the dead. He transformed Osiris not into a corpse, but into something greater, the first resurrected being, the Lord of the afterlife. Without Anubis's skill, Osiris would have remained lost, a body broken and forgotten. With Anubis's care, he became eternal, ruling the underworld, welcoming the souls of the departed. The image of Anubis at the embalming table became central to Egyptian belief. In tomb paintings, he is often shown bending over the body of the deceased, just as he bent over Osiris. His hands are steady, his expression calm. There is no violence in this act, only devotion. By embalming Osiris, Anubis became the protector of every body, every soul. What he did for the king, he would do in spirit for all people. This story is more than myth. It reflects the Egyptians' deep reverence for the dead. They believed that to preserve the body was to ensure the soul's survival. Anubis, who first embalmed Osiris, was therefore not just a god but a model, showing priests how to perform their sacred work. The rituals of mummification, the long process of cleansing, drying, wrapping, and blessing were all acts carried out under his guidance. Priests wearing masks of the jackal became his living representatives. When they bent over the body of a loved one, it was as though Anubis himself was present. The tale also reveals Anubis's loyalty. Though he was sometimes described as the child of Nephthys and Osiris, or of Ra, what mattered here was his devotion. He stood beside Isis in her grief, helped her in her task, and gave order to chaos. Where Set had scattered, Anubis gathered. Where Set had destroyed, Anubis preserved. His work was the opposite of Set's violence. It was restoration, healing, and protection. The Egyptians understood this story not as a distant legend, but as a pattern repeated in every burial. When a person died, it was as though they were Osiris, laid out upon the embalming table. When the priests worked, they were Anubis, reassembling, purifying, preparing. And when the rites were complete, the person was ready to enter eternity, just as Osiris had. Every death reenacted the myth. Every mummification echoed the first one. Even in his title as the first embalmer, Anubis carried a kind of comfort. He was not simply the god of endings. He was the god of care, of the gentle touch, of devotion that does not abandon. His story told Egyptians that when they lost someone they loved, that soul would not be left to decay or to chaos. Just as Anubis had guarded Osiris, he would guard them too. Picture for a moment the quiet of an embalming chamber in ancient Egypt. The air is thick with incense. Oil lamps burn low, casting golden light against stone walls. A body lies upon a table, washed and ready. Around it, priests in white linen move slowly, deliberately, their hands steady, their words whispered prayers. One priest wears the mask of the jackal. He leans over the body, arranging the wrappings, anointing the skin, reciting the sacred words. To those present, it is not only a ritual. It is a moment where the divine touches the human, where Anubis himself is believed to be guiding the work. The story of Osiris's death and Anubis's care explains more than a single myth. It explains why Egyptians placed their hope in the rituals of burial. It explains why Anubis remained such a beloved and trusted figure. He was not a god of distant thunder or blazing power, but a god whose presence was felt in the most vulnerable of moments. He was there in grief, in mourning, in the silence of the tomb. As the first embalmer, Anubis gave humanity a gift, the knowledge that death could be met with dignity, that the body could be preserved, that the soul could pass safely into eternity. His role was not to conquer death, but to transform it, to turn loss into continuity. From Osiris to every Egyptian who ever lived, Anubis's hands touched the passage between worlds, ensuring that no soul would be abandoned. And so, from one story of betrayal and restoration came the eternal image of Anubis, bending over the dead, wrapping them in linen, preparing them for eternity. This is who he became, the guardian of all who die, the one whose work assures that death is never the end. To understand why Anubis is so often shown with the head of a jackal, we must step once more into the Egyptian landscape. Imagine the wide desert stretching beyond the fertile banks of the Nile. The sun bakes the sand during the day, and at night the air cools under a canopy of stars. In this vast silence, there are creatures who thrive where humans cannot. Among them, the jackal. For the ancient Egyptians, the jackal was not an animal observed from afar. It was part of daily life, a presence near villages and tombs alike. Jackals were scavengers, hunters of opportunity, roaming the edges of settlements, searching for scraps or the remains of animals. In the desert, they were often seen near cemeteries, for the shallow graves of the earliest times were vulnerable to disturbance. The people saw jackals prowl these sacred grounds, their dark shapes moving in and out of the half-light. Rather than despising these creatures, the Egyptians gave them a place in their sacred imagination. To them, the jackal became both a warning and a promise. It was a warning because the animal could disturb the dead if not properly buried. But it was also a promise because in the divine form of Anubis, the jackal became the very guardian of graves. By associating the god with the creature most feared at burial sites, they transformed the threat into protection. Anubis was the divine jackal who would ensure no earthly jackal could harm a resting soul. This duality, of danger turned to protection, is at the heart of Anubis's symbolism. His black jackal head was not merely decorative. It carried meaning that every Egyptian could recognize. The black color, too, was carefully chosen. It was not the natural hue of a jackal, but the color of fertile soil left behind by the Nile's flood. Black was the color of life, rebirth, and regeneration. Thus, Anubis's dark visage reminded the Egyptians that death was not decay, but renewal. The jackal itself represented watchfulness. Sleek and cautious, it moved silently, alert to the smallest sound. Anubis inherited these qualities in myth. He became the watchful one, guarding cemeteries, attending funerary rites, keeping restless spirits at bay. No tomb was left unprotected under his gaze. His image was painted on coffins, carved into amulets, and invoked in prayers. To see the jackal form was to feel reassurance. The god of death was near, but he was not hostile. He was there to protect. In the myths, this symbolism deepened. When Set tore apart Osiris, scattering his remains, Anubis, embodying the jackal, sought out the pieces. Just as jackals in the desert sought what was hidden in the sands, so Anubis searched and recovered. But instead of destruction, he brought healing. Where the earthly animal scavenged, the divine form restored. This inversion lies at the core of why the Egyptians gave the jackal such reverence. They believed in transformation, in turning danger into blessing, in making the feared animal into a sacred protector. Even the behavior of jackals at night carried meaning. These creatures were most active after dusk, their calls echoing across the desert. To the Egyptians, the night was the time when spirits wandered, when the soul's journey began after burial. The jackal's cry in the darkness was thus woven into their imagination, not as random noise, but as a reminder of the god who guided souls through shadow into light. In the voice of the animal, they could hear the voice of Anubis, calling across the veil. The jackal also symbolized liminality, the in-between. It lived on the edge of deserts and villages, on the border between wilderness and home, between life and death. Anubis, too, was a liminal figure. He belonged neither fully to the living nor the dead, but stood at the threshold, guiding souls across the divide. His jackal form captured this essence perfectly, a being who thrived in margins, who knew the way where others could not go. In art, the jackal-headed god is almost always depicted calmly, his expression composed, his posture steady. Unlike Set, whose animal head conveys aggression and chaos, Anubis's form conveys serenity. The jackal here is not snarling or wild. It is controlled, disciplined, sacred. This is the form that reassures rather than frightens, that brings order to a fearful place. There is also another layer of meaning. Jackals, being creatures of the desert, were well adapted to survival in harsh conditions. They endured heat, hunger, and long journeys across barren land. To the Egyptians, who feared the loneliness of the grave and the challenges of the afterlife, Anubis's jackal form symbolized endurance. He was a guide who could survive the journey into the Duat, the underworld, and who could lead souls through its perils with certainty. And yet, despite all this power, Anubis's jackal image remained humble compared to other gods. He was not crowned like Horus, nor radiant like Ra. His form was simple, the black jackal, ever watchful, ever faithful. Perhaps this simplicity is why he remained so beloved. He was not distant or unreachable. He was close, familiar, like the jackal that wandered near the edges of town. In him, the people saw both the ordinary and the divine, merged into one. The symbolism of the jackal thus tells us much about Egyptian belief. It reveals their ability to look at the natural world and weave it into their vision of eternity. It shows how they transformed fear into reverence, how they saw in the scavenger not just a threat, but a protector. It tells us that their gods were never separate from the world around them, but drawn from it, made sacred by the power of imagination and faith. So when you picture Anubis, with his black jackal head gleaming against the golden walls of a tomb, remember that this image carried layers of meaning. It reminded the living of the desert's watchful guardians. It reassured them that their graves would be protected. It promised them that death, like the fertile black soil, was a beginning as much as an end. And above all, it told them that they were not alone, that even in the silence of night, even in the sands of the desert, a guide was always watching. Of all the roles Anubis played in Egyptian religion, none is more profound or more vividly imagined than his part in the judgment of the soul. It is here, in the halls of Ma'at, that the god of embalming becomes the god of justice. It is here that Anubis stands as the silent attendant, ensuring fairness, balance, and truth in the weighing of the heart. To understand this ceremony, we must picture the Egyptian vision of the afterlife. When a person died, their soul did not simply vanish. It undertook a long journey into the Duat, the underworld, passing through caverns, guarded gates, and fearsome beings. Eventually, the soul reached the Hall of Two Truths, a place of judgment unlike any earthly court. The Egyptians imagined this hall as a vast chamber, its walls lined with 42 divine judges, each embodying a principle of morality or cosmic law. At the center stood a great set of scales. On one side, the heart of the deceased would be placed. On the other side, the feather of Ma'at, symbol of truth, order, and balance. This was the moment of ultimate trial, the weighing of the heart. It is here that Anubis appears. He does not stand far away, but right beside the scales, calm and watchful. His jackal face is steady, his hands ready. He is the one who takes the heart, carefully lifting it from the chest of the deceased and places it upon the scale. He is also the one who steadies the balance, ensuring that no force, divine or otherwise, interferes with the test. His role is not to decide the outcome, but to guarantee its fairness. Imagine, then, the silence of the hall as the heart is placed upon the scale. Every soul who entered this place knew the stakes. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the person had lived in accordance with Ma'at, truth, justice, harmony. They would be welcomed into the field of reeds, to live forever in peace. But if the heart was heavy, burdened with lies, cruelty, or chaos, it would tip the scale. Waiting beside the balance was Amit, the devourer, a monstrous creature part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. Should the scale fall against the deceased, Amit would consume the heart, and the soul would cease to exist, denied eternity. This image is one of the most enduring in all Egyptian belief. It reflects their deep conviction that morality was not a vague ideal, but a cosmic law. Every action, every word, every thought weighed upon the heart. To live unjustly was not only to risk punishment in life, but to jeopardize the soul's eternal survival. Anubis's presence in this ceremony is crucial. His impartiality is his strength. Unlike Set, who represents chaos, or Osiris, who rules as judge of the dead, Anubis is neither accuser nor ruler. He is the guardian of the process. His steady hands remind the soul that the test will be fair. He is a god who inspires trust, because his duty is not to condemn or to absolve, but to ensure that truth alone decides. In many depictions, Anubis is shown bending slightly toward the scales, his long ears attentive, his black form radiating calm. Sometimes the god Thoth, the scribe, stands nearby, recording the result. Osiris sits enthroned at the far end of the hall, awaiting the verdict. But it is Anubis who gives the moment its weight, for without him, the balance would not be certain. The Egyptians saw this ceremony as both terrifying and reassuring. Terrifying, because every flaw of character might tip the heart. Reassuring, because with Anubis at the scales, there would be no injustice, no trickery. Every person, pharaoh or farmer, faced the same measure. In this sense, Anubis was a democratizing figure. Death equalized all, and the god of embalming ensured that equality extended into judgment. The symbolism of the heart is also worth pausing upon. To the Egyptians, the heart was not only an organ of flesh. It was the seat of the soul, the center of memory, thought, and morality. Unlike later traditions that placed thought in the brain, the Egyptians saw the heart as the essence of the self. This is why, during mummification, the brain could be removed, but the heart was left, preserved within the body or placed carefully back inside. To lose the heart was to lose the self. To weigh the heart was to weigh the truth of an entire life. The feather of Ma'at, in contrast, symbolized the universal order of the cosmos. Ma'at was not only a goddess but a principle, the balance that kept stars in their courses, that guided the Nile's floods, that upheld justice in human society. To live in accordance with Ma'at was to live in harmony with everything that existed. Thus, the weighing was not arbitrary. It was the alignment of the individual with the universe itself. Anubis, therefore, was not only weighing hearts. He was placing individuals into the fabric of eternity. A light heart joined the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. A heavy heart fell into oblivion. The precision of his role mirrored the precision of the cosmos, where nothing escaped balance. There is also a gentleness in his presence here. For all the fear of judgment, Anubis was not imagined as harsh or hostile. He was calm, guiding, measured. His role was to ensure the soul received its true fate, not to relish in its downfall. For the Egyptians, this meant that the god who presided over their most vulnerable moment was one who cared for justice, not cruelty. One can imagine how this belief shaped their lives. Knowing that their hearts would one day be weighed, Egyptians placed great value on honesty, fairness, and generosity. Tomb inscriptions often proclaim that the deceased had lived in accordance with mythology, feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, acting with kindness. These were not merely social virtues. They were preparations for eternity. The presence of Anubis at the scale gave these values their sacred foundation. To lie, to cheat, to oppress, was to add weight to the heart. To live truthfully was to lighten it. Anubis would see it all. His black gaze missed nothing, but his hands would remain steady, ensuring that the balance was exact. This vision of justice is remarkably enduring. Even today, the image of scales remains a symbol of fairness in many cultures. In Egypt, thousands of years ago, this idea was already alive, embodied in the jackal-headed god who guarded the boundary between mortality and eternity. So when we think of Anubis in the Hall of Two Truths, we see more than a myth. We see the Egyptians' deepest hope, that the universe is just, that the soul is measured fairly, and that truth outweighs all else. We see their fear, that a life of cruelty or dishonesty cannot be hidden, that the heart itself bears witness. And we see their comfort, that Anubis, the ever-watchful guide, stands ready to protect the fairness of it all. Beyond embalming and judgment, Anubis held another role that was perhaps the most immediate for everyday Egyptians. He was the protector of tombs. His presence was not only in myth or in the halls of eternity, but in the very cemeteries that dotted the desert's edge. For the living, who buried their loved ones with care and hope, Anubis was the silent sentinel who stood watch against the dangers of the night. The Nile Valley, rich with life, was bordered always by the dry desert sands. It was in these sands that Egyptians laid their dead, building tombs of mud brick or carving chambers deep into rock. The desert was chosen because of its dryness, which slowed decay, but it was also a place of risk. Wild animals roamed there, hyenas, jackals, and other scavengers searching for food. In earlier times, when graves were shallow and unfortified, bodies could be disturbed, bones scattered. To the Egyptians, this was not only distressing but dangerous, for a disturbed body threatened the soul's peace. The image of the jackal prowling near graves became familiar. Yet instead of fearing it entirely, the Egyptians transformed the symbol. Anubis, depicted as a reclining black jackal atop a tomb, became the divine protector. Where earthly jackals prowled, Anubis reigned. His presence promised that the restless creatures of the desert would not disturb the resting places of the dead. It is no coincidence that in tomb paintings and funerary statues, Anubis is often shown in this pose, a sleek black jackal lying calmly, ears raised, eyes alert. He is not snarling, nor in motion. He is still, patient, the very image of vigilance. This was how Egyptians imagined him, eternal guard, whose watch never faltered, whose gaze never turned away. The tomb itself was more than a resting place. It was a doorway to eternity, filled with goods the deceased would need in the next life. To disturb it was to endanger not only the body but the journey of the soul. Tomb robbery was therefore not simply theft, it was sacrilege. And in the Egyptian imagination, it was Anubis who punished such crimes. Texts and inscriptions warn would-be intruders that Anubis, lord of the necropolis, will find them. His divine retribution was feared, for to anger him was to risk being denied peace in one's own death. Priests and families often invoked his name in burial rituals. Offerings of bread, beer, and incense were made to Anubis, asking him to guard the grave, to keep the body safe, and to ensure the soul's passage. In some tombs, amulets of Anubis were buried with the dead, small figures carved in black stone or painted upon linen wrappings. These were charms of protection, a promise that the god would remain close. Even in great royal tombs, like those in the Valley of the Kings, Anubis was invoked. Though these chambers were filled with treasures, what mattered most was the preservation of the body and the peace of the soul. It was believed that Anubis walked these silent corridors, guarding the kings in death as he had guarded Osiris. The very layout of some tombs reflects this guardianship. Statues of Anubis were placed at entrances, as if to warn intruders that the god himself stood watch. There is a famous artifact known as the Anubis Shrine, discovered in the tomb of Tutankhamun. It shows the god in his jackal form, stretched gracefully upon a shrine, covered in black resin, with eyes inlaid in gold and white. The shrine was placed facing the entrance of the burial chamber, a silent guardian standing between the king and the outside world. For those who entered the tomb, the message was unmistakable. Anubis was present. He would not allow the king's rest to be disturbed. This protective role speaks to a deeper truth about how Egyptians understood their gods. Anubis was not distant, ruling from the heavens like Ra or seated upon a throne like Osiris. He was present in the dust of the cemetery, in the silence of the tomb, in the places where the living laid their dead. He was not above grief. He was beside it, a guardian close at hand. The guardianship of tombs also carried a sense of continuity. Just as Anubis had preserved Osiris, he now preserved every Egyptian. No person was too humble for his care. Whether a pharaoh in a pyramid or a farmer in a small grave, the presence of Anubis could be invoked. His watch was universal, for death came to all, and the god's guardianship did not discriminate. Picture the desert at night, the stars brilliant overhead, the wind whispering across sand. In the distance, the outline of a cemetery rises, mud-brick tombs, some simple, some elaborate. All are silent, yet in the imagination of the Egyptians, none are unguarded. In that silence lies the sleek form of the jackal god, resting but alert, watching but unseen. To those who buried their loved ones, this vision was a comfort. The dead were not abandoned, but protected. It is this quiet reassurance that made Anubis beloved. He was not a god of thunder or terror. He was a god of presence, of constancy. His guardianship reminded Egyptians that love did not end with death, that the care given to the body by the living was continued by the divine. Anubis was the link between the mortal and the eternal, the watchman who never left his post. Thus, in tombs across Egypt, his image endures. Painted, carved, sculpted, invoked, Anubis remains the silent guardian of the dead. His promise is simple but profound, that rest will be undisturbed, that eternity will be protected, that the passage into the next world will remain safe. And in this promise lies the heart of his guardianship, a role that carried comfort not only to the dead, but to the living who mourned them. To fully understand Anubis, we must look at how he fit into the broader Egyptian pantheon. Rarely did the gods exist in isolation. Their stories overlapped, their roles intertwined, and their relationships defined their power. Anubis, though often portrayed as solitary and silent, was deeply connected to the divine family of Egypt. His ties to Osiris, Isis, Nephthys, and even to Ra and Set reveal not only his origins, but also his place in the cosmic order. Let us begin with Osiris, the central figure of Egyptian myth. In many traditions, Anubis is considered the son of Osiris. This lineage matters, for it links him directly to the story of death and resurrection. As Osiris's child, Anubis inherited the duty of protecting his father's body and ensuring his passage to eternity. The tale of Osiris's dismemberment and Anubis's embalming work reflects this bond. Through his devotion to his father, Anubis became a god for all fathers, all families, all of humanity. Each burial was a remembrance of the first embalming, when a son restored his father and gave birth to eternal life. Anubis's connection to Isis is equally profound. Isis, the great goddess of magic and devotion, sought to restore Osiris after his death. In this sacred task, Anubis assisted her. Together, they became the guardians of resurrection. Isis's incantations and divine magic combined with Anubis's careful, physical preservation of the body. One brought spirit, the other preservation. Their roles complemented each other perfectly. In funerary texts, spells often call upon both, acknowledging that the soul needed the blessing of Isis's words and the protection of Anubis's hands. Nephthys, Isis's sister, is also bound to Anubis's story. In some traditions, she is his mother, conceived through her union with Osiris or, in other accounts, through her bond with Set. Whatever the variation, Nephthys embodies mourning, lamentation, and grief. She is the goddess who stands at the head of the bier, crying for the dead, calling out their names so that they are not forgotten. As her son, Anubis represents the continuation of her role. Where Nephthys mourned, he acted. Where she wept, he preserved. Together, mother and son embodied the Egyptian understanding that death was both sorrow and care, both loss and preservation. There are versions of the myth that cast Anubis as the child of Set, the god of chaos and destruction. If this is true, his role becomes even more symbolic. Born of chaos, he did not inherit it. Instead, he turned toward order, preservation, and justice. In this sense, Anubis is the perfect inversion of Set's violence. Where Set scattered the pieces of Osiris, Anubis gathered them. Where Set embodied destruction, Anubis embodied healing. Even if born of darkness, Anubis chose to guide souls into light. Anubis also held a connection to Ra, the great sun god who sailed across the sky by day and through the underworld by night. In certain hymns, Anubis is called the guardian of Ra's enemies, the one who restrains the forces of chaos in the night journey. This placed him not only in funerary rites, but in the eternal struggle of light against darkness. In serving Ra, he showed that his role extended beyond individual souls to the very cosmos itself. Despite these connections, Anubis was distinct. He never ruled like Osiris, nor waged war like Horus, nor shone with brilliance like Ra. He remained at the threshold, quiet, impartial, present. His role was not glory but guardianship, not dominion but devotion. In this way, he complemented the others rather than competing with them. The Egyptian pantheon, vast and varied, needed figures like Anubis, figures who did not seek a throne but ensured the thrones could endure. In art and ritual, his interactions with other gods are often depicted with great care. In the weighing of the heart, Anubis works alongside Thoth, the scribe, while Osiris waits to pronounce judgment. Each god has a role, and Anubis's is always practical, steady, vital. Without him, the process would falter. With him, it unfolds in balance. His cooperation with others shows that in Egyptian thought, order came not from one god's power alone, but from the harmony of many. The funerary texts also reinforce this interconnection. In the Book of the Dead, prayers are addressed not only to Osiris but also to Anubis, to Isis, and to Nephthys. Together, they form a sacred team, the preserver, the mourner, the magician, the judge. Death was too great a mystery for one god to oversee entirely. It required them all. And yet, within this web, Anubis stands out. While Isis and Nephthys are associated with mourning, their roles are emotional, bound to grief and lament. Osiris is the ruler of the underworld, enthroned and powerful. Thoth is the intellectual scribe, recording judgment. But Anubis remains the god who acts directly upon the body, who bends down, who touches, who works. His closeness makes him intimate. His impartiality makes him trustworthy. His cooperation makes him essential. Through these relationships, we see the Egyptian understanding of divinity. Gods were not rivals fighting for dominance, but interconnected forces, each necessary, each balancing the other. Anubis's link to Osiris emphasized continuity of life after death. His bond with Isis highlighted the blend of magic and ritual. His tie to Nephthys showed the fusion of grief and preservation. His occasional parentage from Set revealed transformation from chaos to order. His service to Ra tied him to the cosmic balance of light and dark. Together, these roles make him unique. Anubis is not only the embalmer, not only the judge's assistant, not only the guardian of tombs. He is all these things, woven into the fabric of Egypt's mythology, tied to gods who ruled the sky, the earth, and the underworld. And through these connections, his place in Egyptian belief became unshakable. So when the Egyptians prayed to Anubis, they did not see him as a solitary figure. They saw him within the greater family of gods, his loyalty proven by his service to Osiris, his care extended by his bond with Isis and Nephthys, his impartiality aligned with Ma'at, and his quiet power respected by Ra. This network of relationships deepened their trust. Anubis was not a god apart, but a god within, woven into every divine story that touched death and eternity. The gods of Egypt did not remain fixed in place. Over the course of 3,000 years, their roles shifted, their stories changed, and their worship evolved. Some gods rose to prominence, others faded into the background, and many exchanged duties as the needs and beliefs of society transformed. Anubis was no exception. Though he endured as one of the most recognizable figures of the pantheon, the way Egyptians understood him changed significantly from the earliest times to the later dynasties. In the earliest layers of Egyptian religion, long before Osiris rose to his throne in the underworld, Anubis was supreme in matters of death. In these early texts, he is described not as an assistant or attendant, but as the very lord of the necropolis. His black jackal form was feared and revered, and his title was often Khnemu, foremost of the Westerners. The Westerners referred to the dead, for the sun set in the west, and the west became the symbolic land of the departed. As foremost, Anubis was imagined as their leader, the one who reigned over all who had passed beyond life. This early supremacy suggests that in the Old Kingdom, Anubis was one of the chief gods of death. He was not merely a guardian or embalmer. He was the ruler himself. Inscriptions in pyramid texts, carved upon the walls of royal tombs, call upon Anubis for protection and guidance. Pharaohs believed that he would personally oversee their passage into the afterlife. His role was both practical and divine, embodying the sacred mysteries of preservation and judgment. Yet, as time passed, the mythology of Osiris began to grow. The story of Osiris's death, resurrection, and kingship of the underworld offered a powerful narrative that resonated deeply with the Egyptian imagination. Osiris was no longer just a god of fertility and agriculture. He became the eternal king of the dead, enthroned in Duat, the underworld. This shift altered Anubis's position. Where once he had been the ruler of the afterlife, he now became the loyal guardian, embalmer, and attendant of Osiris. This change was not a demotion so much as a redefinition. The Egyptians rarely discarded their gods. Instead, they wove new narratives that allowed multiple deities to coexist. Anubis's role evolved from sovereign to servant, from ruler to guide. He became the one who prepared Osiris himself, ensuring the god's resurrection, and in doing so, he set the model for all human death. While Osiris judged, Anubis preserved. The pairing was natural, and the Egyptians found comfort in this balance. The Middle Kingdom saw this transition solidify. Texts of the period more often depict Osiris as lord of the underworld, with Anubis as his faithful assistant. Scenes of judgment show Osiris enthroned while Anubis weighs the hearts of men. This imagery reflects a clear hierarchy. Osiris rules, Anubis serves. Yet even in service, Anubis retained immense authority. Without him, the process of judgment could not unfold. Without him, the dead could not be embalmed or protected. His importance endured, though his title had changed. By the New Kingdom, Anubis's image had become nearly universal in funerary art. Every tomb, from royal to common, bore his likeness in some form. He was shown bending over mummies, standing watch at tomb doors, or guiding the souls of the dead to Osiris. This universality reinforced his accessibility. Where Osiris was a distant king, enthroned in majesty, Anubis was the familiar companion. He was not only for pharaohs but for all people, a god who walked among the tombs, present in every burial. It is also in this later period that we see Anubis associated with Greek interpretations. As Greek travelers and settlers encountered Egypt, they compared Anubis to their own deities. They saw in him similarities to Hermes, the messenger god who guided souls to the underworld. The fusion of these figures produced the composite deity Hermanubis. In this syncretic form, Anubis continued to evolve, merging with foreign traditions while retaining his Egyptian essence. Despite this blending, the Egyptians never abandoned his older imagery. The black jackal remained his symbol, and his role as embalmer never faded. Even when Osiris had long since claimed the throne of the underworld, Anubis was still invoked in prayers, still painted upon walls, still carved upon amulets. His persistence reflects the Egyptians' enduring need for his quiet guardianship. Kings may rule, but guardians endure. The shift in his role also highlights the adaptability of Egyptian religion. Unlike rigid systems where gods remain unchanged, Egyptian mythology was fluid, responsive to cultural needs. As political structures shifted, so too did divine hierarchies. When Osiris became a symbol of kingship and resurrection, Anubis's authority adjusted to complement rather than compete. His evolution demonstrates the ability of Egyptian faith to incorporate change without erasing the old. In many ways, this evolution mirrors the human experience of grief and ritual. In the earliest days, when tombs were simple and preservation fragile, a god like Anubis as supreme protector was essential. Later, as rituals grew elaborate and myths expanded, Osiris offered a richer narrative of judgment and eternal life. Anubis then took on the role of helper, guide, and ever-present protector. His presence was less about rulership and more about constancy. Even in modern times, when we look back upon Egyptian mythology, it is often Anubis's image that endures most vividly. The black jackal, the embalmer at work, the god at the scales, these remain etched in the collective imagination. His role may have evolved, but his essence never vanished. He remained, always, the god closest to death, closest to the tomb, closest to the human heart in its moment of silence. Thus, the story of Anubis's evolution is not one of decline, but of transformation. From ruler to guardian, from sovereign to servant, his place shifted but never weakened. His adaptability ensured his survival, not only in ancient Egypt, but also in the memory of cultures far beyond. The Egyptians understood that death itself is not static. It changes with time, with ritual, with story. And so too did their god of death, who walked with them through every age, guarding, guiding, watching. To understand how deeply Anubis was woven into Egyptian belief, one must look to the Book of the Dead. This collection of spells, hymns, and illustrations was not a single, fixed book but a tradition that evolved over centuries. Families commissioned papyrus scrolls, often beautifully decorated with colorful scenes, to be placed in tombs beside the deceased. Each scroll was personalized, filled with texts that guided the soul through the trials of the underworld. Within these sacred pages, Anubis appears again and again, watchful, guiding, ensuring that every step of the soul's journey was secure. The Book of the Dead was, in many ways, a manual for eternity. It described the landscape of the afterlife, the dangers one might face, and the gods one would meet along the way. For the Egyptians, death was not a single event, but a passage, a long voyage filled with trials. Without the right knowledge, the soul could become lost or trapped. Thus, the book was a companion, its spells recited by the dead or on their behalf. And in this great map of eternity, Anubis played a vital role. One of the most iconic images in the Book of the Dead is the scene of the weighing of the heart. In countless papyri, we see Anubis at the scales. On one side, he places the heart of the deceased, the seat of memory and conscience. On the other, he sets the feather of Ma'at, symbol of truth and divine order. With calm precision, Anubis adjusts the scales, ensuring balance, ensuring fairness. He does not decide the fate, that belongs to Osiris. Instead, he guarantees the process is just. The Egyptians trusted him as the impartial figure, neither swayed by fear nor favor, but devoted only to truth. This role as judge's assistant is depicted with great care. His jackal-headed form leans over the scale, hands steady, eyes alert. To his side stands Thoth, the scribe, recording the outcome. Behind them, often, waits the monstrous Ammit, ready to devour the unworthy soul. Above all sits Osiris, enthroned, with Isis and Nephthys at his side. Yet without Anubis, the ritual could not begin. He is the one who makes the test possible, who ensures that the final measure is honest. Beyond this famous scene, Anubis appears throughout the spells. He is invoked to protect the body, to ward off decay, to repel serpents and hostile spirits. In spell 151, for example, the deceased calls upon Anubis as the lord of the burial place, asking him to watch over the corpse and guide it safely through the gates of the underworld. In spell 125, which accompanies the weighing scene, the soul pleads for Anubis's favor, seeking his recognition as one who is pure and ready for judgment. These invocations reveal that Anubis was not only a figure of ritual, but also a divine companion whom the soul trusted. The images painted upon the papyri reinforce this closeness. In some scrolls, Anubis is shown leading the deceased by the hand, guiding them toward Osiris. The gesture is gentle, almost tender, as if the god himself escorts the soul across the threshold of eternity. In other scenes, he is shown bending over the mummy, performing the rites of embalming even within the afterlife. His care extends beyond the grave, continuing in the spiritual journey. The prominence of Anubis in these texts also reflects the Egyptian need for reassurance. Death was mysterious and uncertain, and though the Egyptians developed elaborate rituals, the fear of what lay beyond remained. Anubis, with his calm presence, provided comfort. His image reminded the living that their loved ones were not alone. His guidance promised that no soul would wander unguided, no body would rest unguarded. In the quiet darkness of the tomb, the Book of the Dead whispered that Anubis would remain near. The artistry of the papyri adds to this reassurance. Anubis is often painted in stark black, the color of fertile soil and regeneration, standing out against golden backgrounds and pale linen. His jackal face, sleek and elongated, carries an expression of watchfulness rather than menace. Even in judgment, his demeanor is steady, impartial. For those gazing upon these images, whether in life or in the imagination of the afterlife, his presence conveyed peace. Over time, the spells of the Book of the Dead became standardized, and yet Anubis's role never diminished. From the Old Kingdom pyramid texts to the Middle Kingdom coffin texts, and finally into the New Kingdom papyri, his duties remained constant. He preserved, he guided, he weighed. His constancy across centuries suggests that Egyptians could not conceive of the afterlife without him. No matter how the myths evolved, Anubis remained a pillar. It is also worth noting that these texts were not reserved for pharaohs alone. By the New Kingdom, ordinary Egyptians who could afford them placed copies of the Book of the Dead in their tombs. In these personalized scrolls, Anubis was still present, guiding not only kings but also farmers, artisans, and scribes. His guardianship was universal. His care, like death itself, extended to all. Imagine, then, a tomb deep in the cliffs along the Nile. Inside lies a carefully wrapped mummy, beside which rests a scroll of papyrus painted with bright colors. Upon its surface, scenes of Anubis are drawn, weighing, guiding, embalming, protecting. For the deceased, this was not mere art but a living presence, a promise that in the silence of death, the god himself would be near. For the family who left the scroll behind, it was comfort, an assurance that their loved one would not walk the dark path alone. Thus, in the Book of the Dead, Anubis's presence is more than symbolic. It is essential. He is the protector at the threshold, the guide along the path, the arbiter of truth, the eternal embalmer. His figure binds the entire ritual together, bridging the moment of burial with the eternal journey of the soul. And for the Egyptians, that bond meant peace. To look upon his image was to know that death was not abandonment but accompanied by divine care. When we picture ancient Egypt, we often imagine colossal temples rising above the Nile, filled with towering statues of gods and pharaohs. Yet Anubis, unlike Ra or Ammonius, was not always worshipped in grand temples open to the masses. His presence was quieter, more intimate, bound to the spaces of the dead. Still, he was not without sanctuaries, and the cults devoted to him reveal much about how Egyptians related to this silent guardian of the tomb. Anubis's worship was unique because it was rooted in funerary practice. He was not a god of the public square, but of the necropolis. His temples were often linked to cemeteries, mortuary chapels, and places where embalming took place. These spaces were sacred workshops, where priests performed the holy rites of preservation, invoking Anubis to guide their hands. In this sense, his temple was the tomb itself, and every burial became an act of worship in his name. One of the most significant centers of Anubis's cult was Sinopolis, literally, city of the dog, in Middle Egypt. Here, the jackal god was honored with particular devotion. Archaeological evidence suggests that the city may have hosted temples, shrines, and even cemeteries for sacred dogs associated with Anubis. These animals, carefully buried in great numbers, were likely offerings made by worshippers seeking the god's protection. To the ancient mind, the dog or jackal was not merely an animal, but a living link to Anubis himself. In other regions, Anubis shared space with gods more prominent in state cults. In temples of Osiris, for example, side chapels were sometimes dedicated to Anubis. His presence was natural, for he was the one who had embalmed Osiris and continued to serve as his faithful guardian. In these shared spaces, worshippers might offer prayers or small votive figures of Anubis, appealing for his guardianship in their own deaths or for the safe passage of their loved ones. The priests of Anubis held a distinctive role. Known as the servants of the jackal, they wore masks of the god during funeral rituals. In tomb paintings and reliefs, we sometimes see these priests, their faces hidden by long, black jackal masks, bending over mummies as if Anubis himself were present. This ritual disguise blurred the line between human and divine, making the embalming not only a practical process, but a sacred reenactment of myth. To the grieving family, it was not merely a man preparing the body, it was the god himself, fulfilling his eternal duty. Worship of Anubis was not limited to the rituals of embalming. Offerings were made in his name. Loaves of bread, jars of beer, and incense burned upon altars. Families who visited tombs would leave small gifts, asking Anubis to keep the resting place undisturbed. In some cases, amulets bearing his image were worn by the living as a form of protection, not only for death, but for safety in life. His guardianship extended beyond the tomb, offering peace of mind to those who feared the unknown. Unlike other gods, whose temples dominated cities and whose festivals were celebrated with grandeur, Anubis was honored in quieter ways. His rituals were solemn, not jubilant, for they dealt with grief, transition, and eternity. Yet this quietness did not lessen his importance. Indeed, it made him one of the most intimate of gods. Where others reigned from thrones of gold, Anubis walked among mourners, beside coffins, in the hushed chambers of embalming halls. Even so, festivals in his honor were held. During certain times of the year, processions of his image, often carried as a statue of a jackal lying upon a shrine, would pass through towns and cemeteries. These processions reminded people of his watchful presence, renewing the bond between the living and the dead. The image of Anubis, sleek and black upon a golden shrine, inspired both reverence and comfort. As Egyptian religion interacted with Greek culture in later centuries, worship of Anubis expanded beyond Egypt itself. In Hellenistic times, the god was sometimes worshipped in temples outside the Nile Valley, merged with Hermes as Hermanubis. In these foreign sanctuaries, he retained his role as guide of souls, but was now placed within a broader Mediterranean context. His cult endured because his message was universal: protection in death, safe passage to what lies beyond. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Anubis's worship is how personal it remained. For many Egyptians, worship of Ra or Ammonius was tied to the state and the temple economy. But worship of Anubis was tied to family, to love, to the loss of a parent, a child, a spouse. To pray to him was to place one's grief in divine hands. In the moments when loss felt overwhelming, Anubis was the god who came close, not with splendor, but with quiet guardianship. Thus, his temples were less about towering columns and more about sacred presence in the spaces of mourning. His priests, masked in jackal heads, embodied his care. His statues upon shrines, his amulets upon the dead, his name spoken in funeral prayers, all were forms of worship that endured for millennia. Anubis may not have had the grandest temples or the largest festivals, but his worship was steady, intimate, and deeply human. For in the end, every Egyptian, no matter how great or humble, would encounter him. To honor Anubis was to prepare for that encounter, to trust that when the moment came, the god who once embalmed Osiris would extend the same care to them. Of all the roles attributed to Anubis, none was more closely tied to his image than embalming. To the Egyptians, The preservation of the body was sacred. They believed that for the soul to endure, the body had to remain intact. Without preservation, the spirit could not recognize its vessel and might wander lost. Thus, the act of mummification was not simply a practical craft. It was a holy rite, a reenactment of the first embalming performed by Anubis upon Osiris. Let us imagine the process as it unfolded in the embalming houses, often situated at the edge of the desert, near the necropolis. The structures were modest, sometimes tents or mud brick chambers, but within them unfolded a ritual that carried the weight of eternity. Families entrusted their loved ones to the priests, who were trained not only in craft, but in sacred incantation. These priests were sometimes called priests of Anubis, for they worked under his watchful presence. The process began with purification. The body was washed with palm wine and water from the Nile. This act cleansed not only the flesh but the spiritual residue of death. As the priests worked, they invoked Anubis, asking him to oversee their task. To the Egyptians, these were not human hands alone. In the dim light, with incense burning, the presence of the jackal-headed god was near. Next came the removal of internal organs, a step both practical and symbolic. The brain, often discarded, was carefully withdrawn through the nostrils using hooked instruments. The heart, however, was usually left in place, for it was the seat of the soul and would later be weighed in the hall of Ma'at. The lungs, stomach, liver, and intestines were removed and preserved separately. Each was embalmed and placed in canopic jars, vessels guarded by protective deities. This stage of the ritual was considered delicate, for it opened the body. The priests chanted prayers, asking Anubis to protect the deceased during this vulnerable moment. The empty body was then dried using natron, a natural salt found in Egypt's desert lakes. The body was covered and filled with this substance for many weeks, until all moisture had been removed. This was the slowest part of the process, requiring patience and vigilance. To the Egyptians, it was not simply drying, it was transformation. The body was being made eternal, no longer flesh alone, but a vessel prepared for the journey to the afterlife. In these weeks of waiting, families often visited to bring offerings and prayers, asking Anubis to guard the process unseen. After drying, the body was washed again and anointed with oils and resins. These substances gave flexibility to the skin, but they also carried symbolic meaning. Fragrant oils were associated with divinity, purity, and rebirth. As the priests applied them, they recited hymns to Anubis, thanking him for guiding the process so far. The black resin, used to coat and protect the body, echoed the black color of Anubis himself, the color of fertile soil, of regeneration, of life after death. Then came the wrapping. This was the most elaborate stage, often taking many days. Strips of fine linen, sometimes hundreds of meters in length, were wound around the body with care. Amulets were placed between layers. The scarab, symbol of rebirth, the eye of Horus, symbol of protection, and sometimes small figures of Anubis himself. Each wrapping was accompanied by prayers and spells, many drawn from the Book of the Dead. The act of wrapping was not only physical preservation but a magical binding, ensuring that no force could harm the deceased. One of the most important rituals performed during this stage was the opening of the mouth ceremony. With special tools, the priests touched the lips of the mummy, symbolically restoring the ability to breathe, speak, and eat in the afterlife. This ritual was often carried out with statues as well, ensuring that the soul had multiple vessels through which to live. Anubis's presence was invoked here too, for he was the one who had restored Osiris, giving him the means to live again beyond death. Throughout these steps, the priests often wore masks of Anubis. In tomb paintings, we see their black jackal faces bending over the deceased, hands steady, performing sacred tasks. This was more than theatrical. To the Egyptians, the mask allowed the priest to embody the god, making the embalming not a human act but a divine one. When the mask leaned close to the body, it was as if Anubis himself performed the work, just as he had with Osiris. When the body was fully wrapped, it was placed within a coffin, sometimes multiple coffins nested together, and often a great stone sarcophagus. The coffin was painted with spells, images of gods, and scenes of the afterlife. Among them, Anubis appeared frequently, standing guard, adjusting the scales, or watching over the mummy. His image reinforced his promise. The deceased would not be abandoned. Finally, the funeral procession carried the mummy to its tomb. Priests walked before, chanting prayers. Family followed behind, weeping and offering. At the entrance to the tomb, last rites were performed. Incense was burned, libations poured, and prayers offered to Anubis. Then, the mummy was laid to rest, surrounded by goods for the afterlife. The door was sealed, but within that silence, Anubis was believed to remain. It is remarkable to note how central Anubis was to every stage of this ritual. He was invoked at purification, at organ removal, at drying, at anointing, at wrapping, at the final sealing of the tomb. He was both participant and overseer, both divine presence and symbolic guardian. To embalm a body was to reenact the myth of Osiris, and in every retelling, Anubis was indispensable. Even after the burial, his role continued. Families visiting tombs would leave offerings not only to their ancestors, but to Anubis himself, asking him to continue his watch. Small statues of the reclining jackal were placed atop shrines or near burial chambers, reminders that his guardianship never ended. In this way, the embalming was not an end but a beginning, a partnership between the living, the dead, and the god who bridged them. The rituals of embalming, though technical, were infused with tenderness and reverence. They reveal how Egyptians saw death not as destruction, but as transformation. Anubis embodied this belief. His hands preserved, his prayers protected, his presence reassured. Through him, the terrifying finality of death became a passage, guided and safeguarded. And through him, the memory of Osiris's first resurrection lived on, repeated with every burial, in every generation. Among the many scenes imagined by the ancient Egyptians, none is more vivid, more haunting, or more central than the weighing of the heart. It was the pivotal moment in the journey of the soul, the decisive trial that determined whether one would pass into eternal peace or vanish into oblivion. At the heart of this ritual stood Anubis, the silent, watchful guide, whose steady hands balanced the scales of eternity. The Egyptians believed that upon death, the soul traveled through the underworld, navigating dangers, tests, and guardians. These trials culminated in the Hall of Ma'at, the grand chamber of truth and justice. Here, before the assembled gods, the soul was judged. And though Osiris presided as the king of the afterlife, it was Anubis who performed the essential task, the weighing of the heart. In Egyptian thought, the heart was more than a physical organ. It was the seat of memory, conscience, and character. The mind resided not in the brain, but in the heart. It recorded every deed, every thought, every intention. Nothing could be hidden from it. Thus, in death, one did not simply face the gods with words, but with the undeniable record carried in the heart. The ritual began with the deceased brought before the great scales. These scales were immense, depicted in art as towering devices with perfectly balanced beams. On one side, Anubis placed the heart of the deceased. On the other, he placed the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. The feather was not heavy, for truth was light, pure, without burden. If the heart was equally light, the balance would hold, and the soul would be declared justified. Anubis is always shown with calm precision in these scenes. His jackal head bent slightly, ears alert, eyes fixed upon the measure. His hands adjusted the weights with care, neither biased nor hurried. He was impartial, for he served Ma'at. In this role, he embodied not only protection but justice, ensuring that the outcome was fair. The presence of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, added another layer. Thoth recorded the outcome, writing the verdict upon his scrolls. Nearby, Ammit, the devourer, waited. This monstrous being, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, crouched near the scales. If the heart proved heavier than the feather, burdened by lies, cruelty, or injustice, Ammit devoured it. To be devoured was to cease, to suffer the second death, the erasure of one's existence. This fate was feared above all, for it meant the soul would never join ancestors, never see paradise, never endure. But if the heart was lighter, if it balanced with the feather, the deceased was declared Masru, true of voice. This phrase appears on countless tomb inscriptions, a proud affirmation that the departed had passed the test. To be true of voice meant one could stand before Osiris, join the blessed dead, and walk in the field of reeds, the eternal paradise where crops grew tall and life continued in harmony. The weighing of the heart was not simply a scene imagined for the afterlife. It shaped Egyptian morality in life. Knowing that one's heart would be weighed encouraged truth, fairness, and balance. To lie, to cheat, to oppress, was to add weight to the heart. To live with honesty, generosity, and respect was to lighten it. In this way, the myth of the scales became a moral compass, guiding Egyptians toward a life aligned with Ma'at. The ritual is vividly preserved in texts such as the Book of the Dead. These papyri, often placed in tombs, contain spells, prayers, and illustrations to aid the deceased in the underworld. Among them, the negative confession stands out. In this text, the deceased addresses 42 gods, declaring innocence. I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not lied. I have not caused pain. These declarations were not empty. They were defenses, appeals for the heart to be judged rightly. Anubis's presence ensured these words would be weighed against truth, not ignored or distorted. In art, the weighing scene became iconic. Tomb walls, papyri, and funerary objects frequently depicted it, ensuring the deceased carried its imagery as a guide. Anubis, sleek and dark, leans toward the scales. Thoth writes with his reed pen. Ammit crouches in tense anticipation. Osiris sits enthroned in the distance, waiting for the outcome. These images remind us how vividly the Egyptians envisioned this trial, how certain they were that death was not an end but a judgment. To imagine this moment in a bedtime narration is to slow down and picture the details. The chamber is vast, lit by an otherworldly glow. The silence is immense, broken only by the soft scrape of the scales as they settle. Anubis moves without sound, his presence steady and sure. The heart rests upon one pan, the feather upon the other. For a moment, time itself seems to pause. All that mattered in life, every act and word, has come to this balance. If the scales align, relief floods the soul. The journey continues. The gods nod in approval. Thoth records the triumph, and the soul is led toward Osiris's throne. If the scales tilt, however, the fear is crushing. Ammit lunges, jaws wide, and the heart is gone. There is no second chance. Anubis does not intervene in mercy. He does not alter the result. He ensures only fairness. His role is not to save, but to measure. This impartiality is important. Anubis was not a god of vengeance, nor of favoritism. He was the guardian of balance. Egyptians could trust that their judgment would not be swayed by bribes, by social standing, or by human error. In the hands of Anubis, justice was absolute. It is fascinating to consider how comforting this image must have been. Death was fearful, yes, but it was not chaotic. It was ordered, weighed, measured. A just person could trust that they would be rewarded, even if unnoticed in life. A cruel person could not escape justice, even if powerful. Anubis, silent and steady, made the afterlife a realm of fairness. Even in later times, when Osiris absorbed many aspects of afterlife judgment, Anubis retained his central place at the scales. His black figure remained indispensable, reminding Egyptians that before eternal paradise came the test of truth. And so his image persisted across centuries, carved in stone, painted on papyri, whispered in prayers. The weighing of the heart was more than ritual. It was a philosophy, a worldview. It taught that every action mattered, that truth was the measure of eternity. Anubis was its guardian, ensuring that no soul entered paradise unworthy, and no soul was denied unfairly. His scales were the axis upon which eternity turned. As we drift into rest, imagining this scene, we can sense why Egyptians found comfort in it. The journey after death was not aimless, not random, but guided by justice. A god with the head of a jackal, calm and impartial, ensured that order was maintained. And in the end, what could be more reassuring than to know that eternity itself was measured by truth, and that the one who measured was steady, unshakable, and incorruptible? Though Anubis did not always occupy the grand stage of mythology like Ra or Osiris, the stories in which he appears reveal his quiet, but indispensable role in the drama of gods and men. They are tales not of conquest or thunder, but of care, of loyalty, and of guardianship. To listen to them is to understand how the Egyptians imagined death not as terror, but as a transition safeguarded by a faithful presence. The most famous story of Anubis is inseparable from the myth of Osiris. When Osiris was slain by his brother Set, his body was torn apart and scattered across Egypt. Isis, the devoted wife, gathered the fragments of her beloved, determined to restore him. Yet it was not she who knew how to prepare the body for eternity, it was Anubis. Summoned by grief and devotion, Anubis performed the first embalming. He cleaned, anointed, wrapped, and protected the body of Osiris, reuniting flesh with spirit. Through his work, Osiris did not simply remain dead. He was transformed into the ruler of the afterlife. This myth explains why embalming was considered sacred. Every mummification repeated the divine act first carried out by Anubis upon a god. Another tale tells of Anubis protecting Osiris's body against the schemes of Set. After Isis had hidden the coffin containing Osiris, Set discovered it and attempted to desecrate the corpse. But Anubis thwarted him, defending the tomb and punishing those who sought to disturb it. In some versions, Anubis even captured Set's followers and flayed them, using their skins as protection. This detail, though grim, explains why priests of Anubis often wore leopard skins during rituals. They embodied his role as protector, clothed in the spoils of those who would threaten the sanctity of the dead. There is also a quieter myth in which Anubis assists Isis during her search for Osiris. As she wandered Egypt, desperate to gather the fragments of her husband, Anubis guided her steps. With the patience of one who knows the desert's secrets, he helped her find what was lost. This story, though less dramatic, shows Anubis as companion as well as embalmer, a presence of reassurance during grief. For the Egyptians, who so often faced loss, the idea of a god who walked beside them in sorrow carried immense comfort. In later myths, Anubis was sometimes portrayed as the adopted son of Isis. After the death of Osiris, she is said to have taken the young jackal god under her wing. In this role, Anubis became not only embalmer of Osiris, but also child of the grieving widow. The pairing emphasizes his closeness to the divine family, binding him forever to their story of loss and renewal. Anubis also appears in tales of judgment. In these stories, he is not the ruler who commands, but the attendant who ensures fairness. He brings the soul before Osiris, adjusts the scales, and verifies the results. In some versions, he even escorts the justified dead into the field of reeds, walking alongside them as they enter eternal life. His role is never that of judge or punisher, but of guide and protector, always near, always steady. One myth recounts how Anubis once sided with Horus, the son of Osiris, in his conflict against Set. While Horus and Set battled for the throne of Egypt, Anubis is said to have aided Horus by protecting sacred places and guarding the remains of Osiris from Set's interference. His loyalty to the lineage of Osiris reinforced his reputation as incorruptible, a god who could not be swayed from duty. Later traditions, especially those influenced by Greek thought, merged Anubis with Hermes, the Greek messenger and guide of souls. This figure, called Hermanubis, embodied qualities of both, the speed and eloquence of Hermes, the solemn guardianship of Anubis. Although this fusion reflects a blending of cultures, it also testifies to how universal the role of Anubis was. Across civilizations, humans imagined a need for a guide to the afterlife, and Anubis filled that role with quiet dignity. The myths of Anubis differ from the thunderous stories of Ra's battles against Apophis or the grand dramas of Horus and Set. They are softer, more intimate, and more human. They speak not of cosmic wars, but of mourning, burial, and remembrance. They show a god who leans close in silence, who tends to the body of a loved one, who stands guard when all else has fallen quiet. For this reason, Anubis may have inspired more personal devotion than gods of greater political power. To every Egyptian, death was certain, and in that certainty, Anubis was always present. The myths also remind us that in Egypt, gods were not distant abstractions, but companions in human experience. When Egyptians buried their dead, They believed they were repeating what Anubis had done for Osiris. When they mourned, they recalled how Anubis had comforted Isis. When they feared judgment, they trusted that Anubis's scales would be fair. In every stage of loss, from the first grief to the final test, Anubis was woven into the story. As we let these myths settle in our imagination, we notice their calming pattern. They do not end in despair, but in continuity. Osiris lives again because Anubis preserved him. Isis endures her sorrow with Anubis beside her. The dead are judged, not with cruelty, but with balance and fairness. Even when hearts are devoured, it is not out of malice, but out of truth. In this way, Anubis embodies a gentle inevitability. He does not fight against death. He guides it, shapes it, ensures that it leads to transformation rather than chaos. These myths, repeated across centuries, gave the Egyptians a sense of stability in the face of mortality. They reassured them that death was not abandonment, but passage. They reminded them that a god of sleek black fur, sharp ears, and watchful eyes would be waiting, just as he had waited for Osiris. And they invited the living, too, to live in balance, so that when the scales were set before them, their hearts would rest as lightly as the feather of Maat. When we think of Egyptian gods, it is easy to imagine them as distant figures celebrated in great temples, invoked by kings and high priests. Yet Anubis was not only a figure of myth or state ritual. For the ordinary Egyptian, the farmer who tilled the fields, the mason who built the walls, the mother who buried her child, Anubis was a familiar and personal presence. He was not confined to the grand rituals of the pharaohs, but found in the quiet prayers of everyday life. Unlike Ra or Ammonius, whose worship was bound to monumental temples and political ceremony, Anubis was close to the people because he touched every family in the same way, through death. Every household, no matter how poor or wealthy, eventually faced the loss of a loved one. And in that moment of sorrow, Anubis became the god most intimately invoked. He was the one who could be trusted to protect the deceased, to guide them safely, to prevent their spirit from wandering or suffering. For ordinary Egyptians, devotion to Anubis often took the form of small offerings at tombs. Families would bring bread, beer, and incense, leaving them at the resting places of their ancestors with whispered prayers. Anubis, keep them safe. Anubis, guard their tomb. These offerings were not grand, but they carried deep meaning. They were acts of love, binding the living and the dead under the watch of the jackal god. Amulets also played an important role. Many common people wore small figures of Anubis, carved in stone or molded in faience, around their necks or placed among their household shrines. These amulets were believed to provide protection not only in death, but in life. A worker might wear one to feel safe from accidents. A mother might place one near her child's bed. The presence of Anubis was not confined to cemeteries. He was brought into the fabric of daily life through these small, portable symbols. The priests of Anubis, though formally tied to embalming houses, sometimes offered their services to families in smaller villages. These priests, wearing their distinctive leopard skins and masks during ceremonies, provided a tangible connection between the divine and the common person. To see the priest masked as a jackal was to glimpse Anubis himself, present in the rituals of mourning. Even if a family could not afford elaborate embalming, prayers to Anubis were offered, seeking his mercy for the deceased spirit. One of the most accessible ways the people connected to Anubis was through the storytelling tradition. Around firelight, parents told their children of how Anubis embalmed Osiris, how he protected the tomb against Set, how he stood by the scales in the Hall of Maat. These stories were not just myths, they were lessons. They taught children that truth mattered, that kindness would lighten the heart, and that in the end, no soul was ever entirely alone. Anubis was always there, waiting at the threshold. In village cemeteries, statues of jackals were sometimes placed to mark graves. These were not grand works of art, but simple carvings, reminders that Anubis watched the necropolis. To see the figure of a jackal upon a tomb was to feel reassurance that the god's guardianship extended even to the humblest grave. This practice reinforced the belief that Anubis was not a god for the elite alone, but for all who faced death, which is to say, for everyone. The presence of Anubis in the common imagination can also be seen in household rituals. small altars in homes, often little more than a ledge or table with offerings of food and light, might include depictions of him. Families prayed to Anubis for the health of the living as well as the peace of the dead. They sought his aid in protecting the household from misfortune, especially from illness or sudden death, which could strike without warning in the ancient world. In this way, Anubis became a companion not only in the final transition but in the daily struggle to endure. Even the landscape tied Anubis to ordinary people. The jackals of the desert, often seen near cemeteries, reminded villagers of the god's presence. These animals, feared for their scavenging yet revered for their sacred association, embodied the paradox of Anubis himself, both terrifying and protective, both of death and of life beyond death. Watching a jackal move silently through the twilight near a burial site was, for many, a living sign that Anubis walked among them. It is telling that Anubis remained a constant in personal devotion, even as the great state gods shifted in prominence over centuries. Dynasties rose and fell, cults of Ammonius or Aten gained dominance and declined, but Anubis endured. The reason was simple: his role was universal. Pharaohs and peasants alike would one day meet him. In this sense, he was the most democratic of gods, serving not the state but the human condition itself. In moments of quiet reflection, one can imagine how comforting this must have been. A farmer working long hours in the fields might wonder about the fate of his parents, buried in the desert sands. A child grieving a lost sibling might take solace in the thought that Anubis stood guard over their tomb. A widow lighting incense might whisper his name, trusting that he carried her prayers to the afterlife. These intimate connections wove Anubis into the daily rhythm of Egyptian life, making him not only a god of priests and myths, but a god of ordinary people. And so, in countless ways, through amulets, offerings, prayers, stories, and silent moments of trust, Anubis lived in the hearts of the common Egyptians. He was not distant. He was not unreachable. He was the god who came close, who leaned into grief, who walked beside the mourners, who guarded the forgotten tomb. To the great kings, he preserved royal bodies in gold-wrapped coffins. To the humblest farmer, he watched over a simple grave of sand and stone. To both, he gave the same gift: the promise of protection, the assurance of passage, the hope of eternity. To understand Anubis is not only to follow his myths and rituals, but also to observe how the Egyptians represented him, how they captured his essence in symbols, in art, and in sacred objects. For the ancient Egyptians, images were not mere decorations. They were vessels of meaning, carrying the presence of the divine. To see the image of Anubis was, in some way, to encounter the god himself. The most familiar depiction of Anubis is that of a man with the head of a black jackal. The jackal was not chosen by accident. Jackals roamed the edges of the desert, often near cemeteries, their sleek forms appearing in the twilight as guardians, or, in more literal terms, scavengers. To the Egyptians, the jackal's association with tombs gave it a sacred dimension. By giving Anubis this head, they acknowledged both the danger of the wild animal and the protective power it could embody. What might have been feared became sanctified, transformed into a symbol of guardianship. The color black is also significant. In Egyptian art, gods could be painted in symbolic hues. Anubis's skin or fur was usually shown as jet black. This did not represent death in the modern sense, but regeneration. Black was the color of the fertile Nile silt, the soil from which life sprang after the flood. By making Anubis black, the Egyptians tied him not to decay, but to rebirth. He was the god who watched over bodies not so they would rot, but so they could live again in eternity. Another common symbol was the recumbent jackal. In many tombs and shrines, statues of a jackal lying flat upon a shrine or platform were placed as protective figures. The jackal is still, yet alert, its ears pricked, its eyes watchful. This posture embodies vigilance. Even in rest, Anubis never sleeps. The image of the reclining jackal became so iconic that it was reproduced on countless coffins, sarcophagi, and papyri, serving as a silent guardian at every stage of burial. Amulets of Anubis also carried deep meaning. Small carvings, often of the jackal form, were placed within mummy wrappings to protect the body. Others were worn by the living, carried as charms against danger. These amulets were not only magical objects, but also constant reminders of the god's presence. In the intimacy of wearing such a piece, the worshipper carried Anubis with them, as if wrapped in his protection. Anubis's connection to the scales of judgment also became a symbol in its own right. In funerary art, he is frequently shown adjusting the scales, ensuring their balance as the heart is weighed against the feather of Maat. The image of Anubis at the scales became an emblem of fairness and justice. To see it was to remember that truth would prevail, that every action carried weight, and that a just God stood watch to ensure balance was maintained. The leopard skin worn by priests of Anubis is another striking symbol. These garments were not chosen for fashion, but for mythic resonance. As told in some versions of Osiris's story, Anubis defeated those who tried to desecrate the body, flaying them and using their skins as his own. The priests, donning leopard skins during funerary rituals, embodied this protective role. The spotted pattern itself symbolized the stars, connecting the earthly act of embalming to the cosmic order of the heavens. In their garments, the priests became living icons of the god they served. Coffins and sarcophagi often carried painted or carved images of Anubis. Sometimes he appears standing beside the deceased, hands raised in protection. Other times, he is shown bending over the body, performing embalming rites. These depictions were more than artistic flourishes. They acted as magical reinforcements. The coffin, which encased the body, was itself transformed into a sacred space by Anubis's image, ensuring his eternal watch. Even the tools of embalming bore his symbolism. Resin, applied to bodies, was sometimes called the oil of Anubis. Knives, hooks, and bandages used in the process were believed to carry his blessing when wielded by priests masked in his likeness. The act of embalming thus became inseparable from his iconography. His symbols were etched into every gesture, every substance, every sound. In later periods, as Egyptian culture interacted with Greek and Roman worlds, the iconography of Anubis evolved. The hybrid figure of Hermanubis often appeared in statues and amulets. This form retained the jackal-headed god, but sometimes combined him with features of Hermes, such as a staff or winged sandals. Even in this blended form, the essential symbolism endured. Anubis remained the guide of souls, the watcher over the journey beyond death. The persistence of his imagery speaks to its power. Long after dynasties had shifted, long after other cults rose and fell, the black jackal remained recognizable. His symbols did not require explanation. To see the recumbent jackal, the black figure, the scales, these were enough to summon feelings of reverence and reassurance. The Egyptians, who lived surrounded by symbols, knew that these images were not mere art. They were bridges to the divine. As we reflect upon the iconography of Anubis, it is easy to sense why he became so enduring. His images are not dramatic or overwhelming. They are quiet, steady, watchful, like the god himself. They do not shout, but they comfort. They remind the living and the dead alike that someone stands guard, that someone ensures balance, that someone will be present at the moment of greatest vulnerability. And so the reclining jackal, the black fur, the vigilant gaze, all of these became part of the visual language of eternity. They adorned tombs, accompanied mummies, decorated papyri, and filled the imagination of a people who placed their trust in the guardianship of a silent god. Through these symbols, Anubis's presence was made visible, enduring not only in myth and ritual, but in the very fabric of Egyptian art and memory. The story of Anubis is not confined to a single age of Egypt's long history. His image, his worship, and his role shifted as centuries passed, adapting to the changing beliefs and priorities of a civilization that endured for more than 3,000 years. Yet through all these changes, Anubis remained a constant presence, a familiar figure in the journey between life and death. In the Old Kingdom, during Egypt's earliest dynasties, Anubis was among the most important gods of the dead. Long before Osiris rose to prominence as lord of the underworld, Anubis held that role. He was the first guardian of tombs, the first judge of souls. Pyramid texts, those earliest sacred writings inscribed within royal tombs, speak of Anubis guiding the pharaoh in death, ensuring his safe ascent to the afterlife. In these early centuries, he was central, a god not only of embalming but of judgment itself. As time went on, however, the myth of Osiris grew in power. By the Middle Kingdom, Osiris had become the reigning figure of the afterlife, the eternal king of the dead. Anubis's role shifted. No longer the ruler of the underworld, he became its attendant, the embalmer of Osiris, the guardian who escorted souls to the throne of judgment. This transition reflects how Egyptian religion evolved, weaving older deities into new frameworks rather than erasing them. Anubis was not diminished, but redefined, his role refined into one of loyal service and guardianship. During the Middle and New Kingdoms, Anubis became especially associated with the practices of mummification. As embalming grew more elaborate, his presence became indispensable. Tomb art from this era often shows him bending over the body of the deceased, hands extended in the act of wrapping. In papyri, he is pictured at the scales, ensuring fairness in the weighing of the heart. These images became standard, repeated across generations, embedding Anubis firmly into the rituals that every Egyptian expected to face. His cult centers also developed during this period. Sinopolis, the city of the dog, rose as a major hub of his worship. There, sacred animals were bred, buried, and honored in his name. The city became a pilgrimage site, where ordinary people could appeal directly to the jackal god for protection. The presence of these centers shows that his influence was not confined to funerary chambers alone, but spread into the devotional lives of communities. By the late period, when Egypt faced political upheaval and foreign influence, Anubis remained steady. While other gods rose and fell in state importance, he endured because his role was universal. The need to embalm, to bury, to pray for protection in death, these never faded. Even under Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, Anubis continued to be invoked in funerary rituals. His symbols, black jackals, reclining statues, amulets, remained unchanged, a thread of continuity in turbulent centuries. It was in the Greco-Roman period that Anubis experienced one of the most fascinating transformations. The Greeks, encountering Egyptian religion, identified Anubis with their own Hermes, the swift guide of souls. The hybrid god Hermanubis emerged in art and devotion, combining the features of both. Statues of Hermanubis often show a youthful figure holding a caduceus, yet with the jackal's head of Anubis. This blending did not erase his Egyptian essence, but rather expanded it, making his guardianship a bridge between cultures. To Greek and Roman devotees, Hermanubis represented the universality of the soul's journey, uniting traditions from different worlds. In Roman times, Anubis even appeared in magical texts and rituals far beyond Egypt. His name was invoked in charms and incantations, often linked to protection in the face of death or uncertainty. This spread shows how adaptable his image was. Whether as embalmer, guardian, judge, or guide, he could serve the needs of many cultures. What is remarkable is the persistence of his imagery. From the earliest pyramid texts to the latest Roman papyri, Anubis appears with little alteration. His sleek black form, his vigilant jackal head, his association with tombs and embalming, all remain constant. While his status shifted from lord of the underworld to servant of Osiris, his essential qualities never changed. He was always watchful, always protective, always tied to the passage from life into death. This continuity suggests that Anubis spoke to something timeless in the human condition. Dynasties rose, capitals moved, foreign armies came and went, but death remained. And with it remained the need for a guardian, a protector, a steady hand at the threshold. In this sense, Anubis was not only a god of Egypt, but a god of humanity, embodying the universal need for reassurance in the face of mortality. As we reflect on his long history, we see that Anubis was not diminished by change, but enriched by it. He began as the great lord of the necropolis, transitioned into the embalmer of Osiris, adapted as Hermanubis under Greek influence, and endured into the Roman world. Each age gave him a new role, but each role preserved the same essence: the watchful jackal, silent and steadfast, guiding souls on their way. Even today, thousands of years later, his image endures. Museums display his statues, papyri show him at the scales, and his black jackal form remains instantly recognizable. Though the civilization that created him has long since faded, Anubis continues to guard memory itself, a reminder of how deeply humans yearn for guidance in the face of the unknown. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of Egypt, has walked a long road through history. His earliest images were carved into the stone of old kingdom tombs. His prayers were whispered in desert winds. His name was invoked at countless burials across centuries. Yet his story does not end with the decline of pharaonic Egypt. In many ways, Anubis has continued to live, resurfacing in art, in literature, and even in popular imagination. His legacy is one of resilience, showing how symbols of death can also become enduring companions for life. When Egypt fell under Roman rule, many of its gods faded into obscurity. But Anubis endured, partly because his role was universal. Every culture wrestles with death, and the need for a guide, a guardian, is timeless. As Hermanubis, the blending of Anubis and Hermes, his image traveled beyond the Nile. Roman amulets bore his likeness, and magical papyri invoked his name for protection. Even as temples closed and the old religion waned, his watchful presence remained etched into artifacts, ensuring he was not forgotten. In the centuries that followed, as Egypt's ancient religion gave way to new faiths, Anubis entered the realm of memory and myth. Medieval travelers and scholars who visited Egypt saw statues of jackals and figures of strange animal-headed gods. Though they did not always understand their meaning, they recorded them in texts, keeping his image alive. In this way, Anubis became part of a broader fascination with the mysterious world of ancient Egypt, a world that lingered as ruins, carvings, and silent statues. The rediscovery of Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries brought Anubis back into the spotlight. As archaeologists unearthed tombs, papyri, and coffins, depictions of the jackal-headed god captured imaginations across Europe. In museums, statues of reclining jackals were displayed as treasures of the past. Scholars translated the Book of the Dead, with its vivid scenes of Anubis overseeing the weighing of the heart. For a Victorian audience hungry for mystery and exoticism, Anubis became a figure of both fear and fascination. Writers and artists soon wove him into their creations. Gothic novels evoked his image to conjure a sense of the uncanny. Painters depicted him among ruins, a shadowy guardian of forgotten kings. Poets described him as the silent guide, a symbol of the mysteries of mortality. These works did not always capture his true Egyptian role, but they amplified his aura, transforming him into a figure of universal mystery. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Anubis found a new life in popular culture. Films, novels, and video games have drawn on his image, sometimes with accuracy, often with imaginative freedom. He has appeared as a guardian in adventure stories, a symbol of fear in horror films, and a powerful deity in fantasy worlds. His jackal-headed form, sleek and unmistakable, is easily adapted to new settings, whether in a museum thriller or a science fiction tale. What is striking is how consistently his core qualities remain intact. Whether in ancient papyri or modern cinema, Anubis is portrayed as a guardian, a figure of transition, a presence at the edge of life and death. Sometimes he is feared, sometimes revered, but always recognized as the one who stands watch at the threshold. Even when creative liberties are taken, his essence, the quiet, watchful guide, remains. Beyond entertainment, Anubis also continues to inspire spiritual seekers. In modern times, some groups interested in reviving or reimagining ancient Egyptian religion still honor him in rituals. They see in Anubis a timeless protector, a being who provides comfort in the face of mortality. His role as embalmer and guide resonates with those who seek symbols of care, transition, and continuity. Art too has embraced his image. Sculptors and illustrators have reimagined Anubis in countless forms, sometimes as a sleek, modern figure, sometimes as a faithful recreation of ancient depictions. His likeness adorns jewelry, clothing, and tattoos, chosen not only for aesthetic appeal, but for the sense of guardianship he represents. People mark their bodies with his form as a declaration of protection, a reminder of resilience, or an embrace of mystery. The legacy of Anubis also extends into scholarship and education. Museums around the world feature statues, coffins, and amulets bearing his image. Visitors pause before these relics, reading placards that describe his role as embalmer and guide. In classrooms, his story is retold as part of the broader tapestry of Egyptian mythology. For many, Anubis serves as an entry point into the wonders of the Nile, an accessible figure who embodies the civilization's deep concern with life, death, and eternity. And yet, even with his wide reach into modern imagination, there is a serenity in how he is remembered. Unlike other gods who may be reshaped into figures of chaos or spectacle, Anubis remains calm, composed, protective. His role is not to rule or to destroy, but to guide, to care, to watch over. That constancy is perhaps why he endures. In a changing world, his image reassures us that some truths remain. We all face death, and we all long for a guardian in that passage. So we find him today not only in museums and media, but also in the quiet imagination of those who seek comfort. To picture Anubis is to picture a figure standing watch in the shadows. Not hostile, not cruel, but steady, patient, present. His ears are raised, his eyes attentive. He waits not to harm, but to guide. His legacy is one of presence, the presence of a companion who never abandons those in their most vulnerable hour. In this way, Anubis continues his ancient work. Though the Nile temples are silent and the desert tombs long buried, his story has not faded. It has simply shifted, finding new voices and new listeners. From sacred amulets to silver screen, from whispered prayers to modern tattoos, his form endures. The jackal-headed god, guardian of the threshold, remains a companion to humanity, yesterday, today, and perhaps forever. As we come to the end of this long journey through the myths, history, and legacy of Anubis, let us pause and reflect. We have traveled far, across deserts and temples, through tombs and papyri, from the earliest dynasties to the present day. At each stage, we have seen how Anubis remained steadfast, a silent presence in the shifting sands of time. He was the protector of pharaohs, the guardian of commoners, the embalmer of Osiris, the guide of every soul. What lingers most in his story is not grandeur, but constancy. Unlike the radiant sun gods or the kings of heaven, Anubis is quiet. He does not dominate the sky or command armies. Instead, he keeps watch at the edges, at the thresholds where fear and uncertainty dwell. In this, his power is subtle but profound. For it is often in those quiet moments of transition, between day and night, life and death, waking and sleep, that we long for reassurance. Anubis is that reassurance, a reminder that even in endings, there is guidance. Think of the black jackal, reclining yet alert. His body rests, but his ears are pricked, his eyes always open. This is the image of vigilance, of care that never ceases. To the ancient Egyptians, this symbol meant protection for the soul. But for us, it can also mean protection for the mind at rest. To imagine Anubis near is to imagine a guardian of stillness, a companion who allows us to let go, to surrender to quiet. Across dynasties, his role shifted, but his essence never did. In the Old Kingdom, he was the first great lord of the dead. In the Middle and New Kingdoms, he became the embalmer of Osiris, the steady hand preparing bodies for rebirth. Under Greek and Roman influence, he merged with Hermes, becoming Anubis, guide of souls across cultures. Yet through all of this, he remained the same at heart, watchful, loyal, protective. There is something soothing in that constancy, something we can carry into our own rest. His legacy reminds us that human beings, across time and place, seek comfort in the face of uncertainty. The Egyptians saw death not as an end, but as a transition, a passage that required care and honesty. Anubis was the one who guided that passage. Today, even as we face the smaller transitions of daily life, the shift from waking to sleeping, from activity to stillness, we can imagine Anubis as a gentle presence, walking beside us as we let go of the weight of the day. Now, as you lie here listening, allow yourself to feel the slow rhythm of your breath. Inhale softly, exhale gently. With each breath, picture the sands of the desert stretching wide and calm. The sky above is filled with quiet stars. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal sits at the edge of the horizon, still and watchful. This is Anubis, the eternal guardian. He is not here to alarm, but to reassure, to keep vigil so that you may rest. Feel the weight of the day, your thoughts, your worries, settling into the sands. The desert has held the memories of countless lives, and it can hold yours too. Anubis, with his patient gaze, watches over them, ensuring they do not trouble you now. You are free to drift, to let your heart feel lighter, as if it too has been weighed and found in balance. Imagine the soft glow of torchlight in an ancient tomb. The walls are covered in gentle carvings of gods and stars. In the center lies a figure, wrapped and still, not in fear but in peace. Anubis stands nearby, his hands raised in blessing. He is not distant, but close, offering comfort in silence. You too can feel that presence, quiet, steady, protective, as you sink deeper into stillness. As your body relaxes, let your mind drift over the long arc of Anubis's story. From the earliest tombs to modern imagination, he has endured, not as a god of fear, but as a god of guidance. His very constancy across millennia is proof of his power, not in thunder or spectacle, but in quiet watchfulness. That same quiet is with you now, wrapping around you like the linen bands of a mummy, not to confine, but to hold you gently, securely, allowing you to rest. The ancient Egyptians believed that Anubis never abandoned a soul. He stood beside every heart as it was weighed, ensuring justice, ensuring balance. In this belief lies a universal comfort, that no one faces transitions alone. Not the greatest pharaoh, not the humblest farmer, not any one of us. In this moment, as you ease into sleep, you too can carry that comfort. You are not alone. There is a guardian at the threshold, a presence watching over you. Now, let your breath become even slower. Inhale as though drawing in the cool air of the desert night. Exhale as though releasing your worries into the sand. With each breath, you feel lighter, calmer, more at ease. Your body rests, your mind drifts, and Anubis remains watchful, his jackal ears tuned to silence, his eyes steady in the dark. Allow the images to fade now, the temples, the tombs, the myths. Let them dissolve into starlight. All that remains is a sense of safety, of guidance, of gentle presence. Anubis, the guardian of thresholds, stands at the edge of your awareness, keeping vigil as you journey into sleep. You may let go, for he will remain, patient and silent, until you wake again. And so, with this final thought, we close the story. The sands of Egypt stretch quiet and eternal. The stars will overhead in their ancient rhythm. And Anubis, timeless as the desert, continues his watch. Rest now, knowing you are guided, knowing you are safe, knowing you are not alone. Sleep, as countless souls before you have, under the silent guardianship of the jackal god.